Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 440, and my guest is Simon Parkin. Simon is a video game critic, journalist, author, and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's contributed to The New Yorker, Harper's, The Guardian, among others, and his previous book, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, is a New Yorker Book of the Year and winner of the Wingate Literary Prize. His new book, The Forbidden Garden, The Botanists of Besieged Leningrad and Their Impossible Choice, is the true story of the botanists at the world's first seed bank who faced impossible choices during the siege of Leningrad: eat the collection to prevent starvation or protect their life's work to prevent world hunger. I learned of Simon on Blue Sky app in my first days of being on that app, and he was posting about this book, and I thought, this is an interesting person. I need to talk with him. He was very kind. He answered me right away, and we set up this conversation, and it is a delightful one. I think you'll really enjoy Simon and our conversation. Check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests and the show. Hey Human Podcast is on YouTube under Official Susan Ruth. I'm on Patreon at Susan Ruthism. My TikToks and Instagram and Blue Sky is Susan Ruthism. And check out SusanRuth.com to learn more about me and my other artistic endeavors and find my music, my albums on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your music. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on Apple, iHeart, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, be love. Happy New Year, and here we go. Simon Parkin, welcome to Hey Human.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's lovely to see you. Welcome.
You too.
Yeah, I saw you on Blue Sky, the new place.
The new place, yeah.
And just started digging into your body of work, and I immediately said, this is a person I have to talk with. So thank you so much for saying yes.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right in. I like to start these conversations finding out a little bit more about you, how your upbringing was, and how that shaped you.
Yeah, I grew up in the south of London in a place called Kew, which is near Richmond, if anyone knows the area, or Kingston. And I went to school in a place called Wimbledon, which people will know because of the tennis. Quite a book-loving family. My dad is a book collector, and so he would take me to events like jumble sales, whatever, but also, places where you buy secondhand books and all of that. And he would go around looking for first editions of Daphne du Maurier books he liked to collect, and Jean le Carré and people like that. Those are the kind of things he was into. And so, yeah, I was around that and got into books myself and, read lots. And I had a little collection of Enid Blyton books, if you know that children's author from the 50s and 60s. And I was into sort of English and all of that from a young age and wanted to be a writer quite young, really, I think, and got some encouragement from my English teacher, as young people who go on to become writers often do. And that stuck with me. For a little while, I wanted to be in a band, so I was also playing music and all of that. So also, like lots of young people, when I was at school, everyone was in bands. And so that was a thing I wanted to do. And we had some successful musicians came out of, the area that I was living in and the school that I went to. And so that was inspirational, but that kind of path didn't quite work out. And I was sort of a writer on the side during that time. And then slowly just the writing became more and more of what I did until it was pretty much totally my job.
All encompassing.
Yeah.
Which instrument did you play?
I played guitar and I sang and did all of that. Yeah.
Songwriter too?
Yeah. Mm.
Nice. Do you ever go back and listen to the songs?
No. No, I don't. Although I got the new Coldplay record I got the other day, and the first track on that is they're accompanied by a guy called John Hopkins, who's a sort of pianist, electronic musician. And I looked him up because I was just interested who it was. And I as soon as I looked him up, recognized his picture. I was like, oh yeah, I went to school with you. I remember him being like a virtuoso pianist and all of that, and playing in, the bands that we were all, we would share each other's bands and like, guest on each other's things that they were recording. And I remember all of that. So that literally just happened last week. So it brought it back to me a little bit, that era of my life.
Oh, that's cool. Maybe it's time to pull the guitar out, noodle around a little.
I don't know.
You write a lot about around wartime, World War II and ending of World War I things. Tell me, why did you get drawn to that particular time period?
Mm-hmm.
And not the Roman Empire like every other?
Well, so my background is a journalist, and I started out right at the beginning writing about technology, so something completely different. And I've covered the video game industry in particular. Like, that's kind of where I started doing game reviews and meeting people who make games. And that's where I kind of cut my teeth as a journalist, really. And then after a while, I was drawn to feature writing, so writing longer pieces. And I started to write outside of tech and just finding interesting stories and writing long form things and learning how to do all of that. I was working on a piece for The New Yorker about war games, which is for anyone who doesn't know, war games are played by militaries and governments to sort of foresee potential outcomes of events. So in wartime, you might play a little war game. If you've got a upcoming battle, you might all sit around and different players will play different roles. One of you might be the opposing forces or whatever. One of you might be the Air Force commander, etc., etc. And you play through this, the real battle that might happen next week or whatever, and try and see, what the enemy's thinking, where you might go wrong just all the different potential outcomes of that battle. And it also happens with politicians. So, for example, when former President Donald Trump visited London a few years ago, in Whitehall, the British government and the civil services ran war games to sort of see, right, we've got a controversial political figure coming to the city. Could there be riots? Let's have one of you plays the police, one of you plays the army, one of you plays the press or whatever, and then they go through the events of the day and see what might happen, where their weaknesses are. So anyway, this happens all the time. All governments do it. It's a really useful way of foreseeing potential events and how they might shake down. And I was meeting with an army major here in the UK who designs these games for the British Army. This was what the radio piece was that I was making. And I said to him, have you got an example where something you found out in one of these war games has proven useful in the real world? And he said, well, back in the 1960s, 50s, whatever, in America, in Washington, there were war games being run and all about nuclear war and the Cold War. And they came up with this idea of, if the world is on the brink of nuclear attack between the Soviets and the US, it makes sense for the American president to be able to have a direct line to the Kremlin to be able to sort that through without having to go through lengthy diplomatic channels. And so, in movies of that era, the red telephone that links the White House to the Kremlin, that's an idea that came out of real war games that were played during the Cold War. And then he gave another example and said, and also during the Second World War, when the British Navy was losing loads and loads of merchant ships to German submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic, there was a little group of young women and a retired naval captain who came up with a war game that helped us understand why we were losing so many ships. And that revolutionized our anti-submarine tactics. And so it was just like one of those things where a light bulb went off in my head, and I was like, that sounds like an incredible story. I'm going to try and find out more about it and see if anyone's still alive who was involved in that or the family members. And that turned into the first book that I wrote about the Second World War, A Game of Birds and Wolves. So it was like completely unplanned, really. It's not like I was like, I want to write loads of books about the 1940s. It's just, I did this one. And then during the course of writing A Game of Birds and Wolves, I found another story and I was like, I'd like to do this maybe as my next book. And that's happened 3 times. So I've just had my 3rd book out, The Forbidden Garden, which is also a sort of broadly unknown story from the Second World War. So that's the 3rd of that sort of trio of books. But I'm going to move away from that era for a little bit now, I think.
Are you tired of it, or you just have something new on the plate?
It's a little bit of both. I'm not tired of that era. I'm just, I suppose, there are some writers, historians who write books and they have like one era. Like you say, it could be the Roman Empire, it could be the Second World War. And here in the UK, there are loads of historians who just write books about the Second World War. That's like a whole section of the bookshop. And that's just not really what I want to do or become. I've got sort of a broader lens, I think, and broader interest. So it's partly to avoid being pigeonholed maybe, but also because there's other stories I want to investigate.
But I would argue that you're not really writing about the war is the backdrop, but you're writing about people and how they operate within the confines of this situation they've been given.
Yeah, I think, that's kind of you say, and that's definitely what I hope I'm doing. Is I'm not so interested in, this battalion fought this battalion and that's what happened. I mean, there are loads of military historian writers who handle that kind of thing. I'm much more interested in human stories and what the effects of living your life against the backdrop of war, the stories that emerge from that or the behaviors that emerge from that. And that's what I've tried to do in my work so far.
Let's get into the new book. It's such an interesting story. Firstly, how did you come upon the story? Also, I felt so bad for the guy that was running it, and he gets old crazy pants Stalin. It's like, you're coming with me. But let's get into how you discovered the story in the first place and then move into it a little bit without no spoilers, of course.
Okay.
I love saying that for historical.
Okay, so the book is about the world's first seed bank that was situated in Leningrad, which is the Russian city now known as St. Petersburg. And I came across the story when I was just reading a newspaper article about a land dispute in the suburbs of the city. There was a developer wanted to build some apartments on some land that belonged to the seed bank. And loads of scientists and botanists around the world sort of threw up their arms and said, you can't build houses here because there are loads and loads of rare trees and plants that were all brought to Leningrad in the 1920s and 1930s and planted in this land. So if you sort of level the land and build houses there, we'll lose all of that biodiversity and those interesting trees. And in the newspaper story, there was just like a throwaway paragraph saying, and during the Second World War, the botanists who worked at the seed bank protected the collection of seeds with their lives during the siege of the city. Yeah, again, it was just like one of those little throwaway lines that made me think, that sounds fascinating. Why did they do that? What happened to them? How many of them survived? And all of those questions that you ask when you hear a little thing like that. And so I went off and just started reading about everything I could find about the story, seeing what had been written about it before, which it turned out was not much. It's one of those stories that I think if you were a seed banker and you're someone who works in that area, you probably know or have heard about the basic story. But most other people, even people who know a lot about, the Eastern Front or the Second World War, don't know this story. So then it was a case of writing to the seed bank, which is still there in St. Petersburg, and saying, explaining who I was and saying, I'm really interested in exploring, maybe writing the story about this. Can you let me know what archival material you have? Do you have any diaries or memoirs or whatever it might be? And someone got back to me from the seed bank and she said, yes, you can come and visit. You can come and look at our archives. We've got material here that relates to that period. So that was my plan. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, which made it very, very difficult for a British person to travel to Russia because Russia views Britain and particularly British journalists not with the most favorable view. So it would have been risky to do so. So thankfully, my contact at the seed bank said, I'll scan all of our documents and send them to you. So she started doing that. And then from that, I was able to get them translated and start to piece together the story of what happened during this 900-day siege. So it's extremely the longest siege of a city in recorded history. Yeah, this group of scientists that started off about 50, and then as some evacuated and others left or whatever, it gets down to about a dozen, and they were there protecting the seed bank through this appalling situation where many people in the city are starving to death, where they've got their own hunger pangs, the seed bank's being bombed, there's all of this stuff going on around them, and they're trying to defend this scientific collection.
Such an incredible story. And what I found so intriguing was the bit about the man in the hospital who died with the seeds strapped to him, and them asking him, what in the world, why did you not eat this? The idea that a body of work that is going to live on forever, that idea that a scientist or a writer or anybody has that gets that we are, it makes me think of the Spock thing of the needs of the few versus the needs of the many, that some things are worth dying protecting because they have to live on. And I just think that seems like such a rare quality anymore.
Yeah.
To have something that one believes in so strongly that one would die for it.
It's maybe common among curators of collections. So you do see that in war zones where you've got museum curators, people looking after a collection of artwork or whatever it might be, that's their job. But it's more than that. It becomes, they feel like stewards of things from the past. And you do see that in museums, even in recent years. I think what made this a little different is that seeds are not artworks, and they are things that can regenerate. And so it makes it more, you kind of think, okay, why would you give your life for something like that? And I think it's worth talking about the background of the seed bank. So you mentioned the director, Nikolai Vavilov, and he started putting the seed bank together in 1921 with a group of his students. And his idea, in the Soviet Union, there had been so much famine. And so he wanted to run experiments that would help eradicate famine, not just in the Soviet Union, but everywhere. And his theory was, let's go around the world, visit every continent, and meet with scientists, meet with farmers, and go walk up onto the mountains or wherever it might be and collect seeds, bring them back to the middle of our city, to our seed bank, and we'll run experiments on them. We'll see if perhaps some wild varieties of wheat, for example, had been overlooked by farmers hundreds of years ago when they were selecting what seeds they were going to use to make wheat. Maybe some of these wild varieties have useful properties. They might be resilient to the cold or resilient to disease or whatever it might be. And we can crossbreed some of these qualities into the seeds that we use to feed everyone. So that was kind of the mission, and they travel everywhere. They go to North America, the UK, Japan, Taiwan, 5 continents, dozens of countries, Vavilov and his little team on these seed collecting expeditions. And by the late 1930s, they've got 250,000 of these seeds. And some of them have been sort of irreplaceable in the way that an artwork would be, in that the habitat has been destroyed, or they've done building there, or there's warfare, or whatever reason, you wouldn't be able to get the seeds again. So part of the motivation, I think, for the scientists when the seed begins and they're faced with some of these terrible decisions, they're thinking, well, some of these seeds are irreplaceable in the same way that the priceless paintings in the Hermitage across St. Isaac's Square are also irreplaceable. So I think you have to sort of think about this biological plant matter in the same way that a curator might think about some rare gold from 1,000 years ago or something like that. That's really the mentality that was leading them to make some of these decisions.
People like this throughout history, they tend to not live very long. Something happens. It just seems that people with this sort of spirit can't endure a planet such as ours.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's especially true in 1930s Soviet Union when you become, Vavilov became famous, so he was known around the world. He partly because of his great vision, partly because he was very personable. He was like an attractive person, and I mean that in the sense that people wanted to follow him and
Enigmatic.
yeah, exactly. And so those qualities certainly put him at odds with, or in risk with Stalin, who was suspicious of anyone who had these international links, who was also suspicious about some of Vavilov's just background that he couldn't help. He was born into a more well-to-do academic-y family rather than peasant stock, which is what Stalin was looking for. So yeah, he was to a certain degree sidelined in the 1930s. And then before the siege begins, so in the summer of 1940, he's out on one of his seed collecting expeditions on the mountains. And a black car pulls up, and four shady looking men get out of the car and say, "Vavilov, you're needed in Moscow. Come with us on important business." But they were
Never get in the car, man. Never get in the car.
he got in the car, and they were soon found out that they were members of the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB, and so he was then subjected to, I think, 900 hours of interrogations, which extracted from him a false confession that he had spied for the British, which wasn't true. But I guess, after that amount of physical deprivation and all of that, he just thought this was a way to stop the beatings from continuing and to stop his friends and people on the outside from getting harmed as well. And he's tried and then sentenced to death, that sentence is then commuted to, I think, 25 years in prison. And so he's sent off to Saratov, to the Gulag. So when the siege begins the following year, the Germany invades the Soviet Union. The German army makes it to Leningrad very quickly. And the botanists who work with Vavilov are kind of left directionless. They don't have their leader. They don't have anyone saying, look, we should evacuate the seeds and get them out of the city as quickly as possible, which was happening at the Hermitage Museum. They had a charismatic director who organized all of that. But the botanists are left floundering. So that's also puts them at a disadvantage, I think, when the siege begins.
Did he die after the siege or before it happened? Do you know the timeline? Did he live long enough to know that his seeds were safe?
No, sadly not. He died in the middle of the siege. The siege is happening a long way away. He's in Saratov, which is about 1,000 miles or so from Leningrad. So he doesn't know anything that's going on. I don't even know if he knew that the city was being besieged. So yeah, it's a real tragedy, and he dies of starvation as well in the prison. So yeah, it's a real double tragedy.
When you're reading about these things as you're doing your research, do you become of it? Or are you able to maintain an observer's point of view?
Yeah, I mean, you are trying to put yourself in that situation and use your imagination based off the true things that you read, the eyewitness accounts. You naturally, as a human being, you imagine what it would be like to be in those rooms. The siege begins in September 1941. And by November, it's getting very cold, and most households have eaten all of the food in their cupboards. And so you start to think, right, how long could I survive for with what I've got in my home right now? And it's important, I think, to think of those things. That's how, if you're writing history, that's how you have empathy with the people you're writing about, and you bring that to readers as well, and you bring it to life. And for me anyway, you're constantly looking for the little details that humanize these scenes, and so it doesn't just become like dry history of X number of people died in this while trying to do this. You want to like take people into, this is what it was like on October the 21st when 5 bombs landed on the roof, and 3 of the botanists run up and they have to kick the incendiaries off the roof, and someone down in the courtyard then chuck sand on it, and all the while they haven't got much strength because they aren't taking in enough calories. And so you're trying to find those details that put you in that situation as much as possible, certainly with the kind of books I'm interested in writing.
Has it made you buy extra things at the Tesco?
Stockpiling, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I've not become a prepper as a result, but I can see why people would do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much for these things to break down, the supply lines and supply chains. And when you like I haven't grown up in a backdrop of war, and so you don't have that first-hand awareness of how our food gets to a supermarket or whatever, and actually how fragile some of those things are. It doesn't take much for those things to break down, and suddenly everyone's panic buying. I mean, that happened a little bit in the pandemic, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think too, books like yours create a remembrance that, oh wait, this food doesn't just come as is. Somebody grew it, and they grew it from a seed, and that seed had to come from its original source, and someone fostered that into my belly eventually. And we just don't have thoughts like that in our day-to-day world, and I think they are very important to have those thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that's true as well for the citizens in Leningrad. It's an urban city. It was sophisticated, multicultural. It was all of those things that we would associate with living in a city today. And then they go through particularly this first winter, where suddenly there's no food, there's no firewood. You're having to burn your books to keep your room warm. You're having to barter items that before the siege would have been very valuable, like a sewing machine or something, or a typewriter, and you're bartering that for some bread because the economy's been rearranged. And so I think for those people, they had a stark realization of, actually, it brings you back to what are the important things that our bodies need on a week by week basis. It just brings you back to that base layer of the hierarchy of needs. And then in the spring of 1942, suddenly there's this citywide growing campaign, and every green space becomes, you get given a little plot and you can grow your cabbages on there. And you're going to do that because just 3 months ago, you had such a keen awareness that, oh, if I'm not growing food, then there's no like stopgap, there's no safety net here. So it just, I think, for urbanite Leningraders, connected them so in this real elemental way to what it means to like grow your food and have to eat it.
So interesting. Like, I stockpile seeds because you never know. Maybe I'm 1/4 prepper. Yeah, I think it's good to be prepared for the unknown, and if it never arrives, then great, but just in case.
Right. Yeah. Pea shoots, that's what they eat those because you can grow those at relatively low temperatures, and they grow quite quickly, and they have quite a high yield. So that's one of the first things. They don't eat any of the collection, and they don't grow anything from it, but they have some pea seeds that I think are from outside of the collection, and so that's one of the first things they start growing inside the Plant Institute.
Do you know if there's any kind of memorial erected for him, for Vavilov?
Yeah, so the seed bank is still there, like I say, off St. Isaac's Square, and there are 2 or 3 rooms of the building given over as sort of a memorial to his life and work, with paintings and his notebooks and things under glass.
I'm glad to hear that. That's good that it wasn't lost.
Yeah, but it took a long time for they have had him on a stamp in Russia as well, but this took decades, for the restoration of his reputation, and for it was really down to the efforts of an academic journalist called Mark Popovsky, who in the 1950s and 60s decides he's going to try and find out what happened to Vavilov. And he goes to the prison where he was kept, and he interviews some of the guards there, and he manages to access the interrogation files somehow. He convinces them to show them to him, which had they known what he was going to do, they would never have done. So he manages to get this information about what happened to Vavilov, and he then writes a book, knowing that it will. I think one of his friends said to him, "There must be easier ways to commit suicide than writing this book." So he knows the stakes of writing this, but nonetheless writes down the book that later becomes the Vavilov affair, and smuggles copies out of the Soviet Union, where it's then published. And if it wasn't for his work, I don't know if Vavilov's reputation would have been restored, and he would have been on stamps and all of that. Perhaps not. I don't know.
This is kind of a crazy question, but I'm always intrigued by people's dreams. When you are immersed in these worlds, does it change your dreams? Do you end up, do you know what I mean? Like, does that world then encompass your sleeping time as well?
Yeah, it's funny. You start to live in two places at once. That's certainly true, because you're trying to just constantly reading as much as you can, as much eyewitness testimony as you can about one of these situations, and trying to put yourself in it so that when you come to write about it, it feels authentic and weighty. And yeah, that probably does change your brain makeup. I can't think of any specific dreams I've had, but you do. I don't know. I've heard another writer, Ian McEwan over here, says writing a book is like having an illness, and it doesn't like lift off you until you've finished your draft. And there is something to that, because you do sort of enter a slightly different state while you're in it, and then you feel yourself emerging at the end of it. So yeah, it does affect you in quite deep physiological ways, probably.
Yeah. Are you concerned at all at the maybe lack of reading that takes place anymore? Or do you think that it will swing back to people wanting to read again? I, like you, am a big book person. And I saw something the other day. It said there's two kinds of hobbies: those who read books and those who collect books.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things competing for our attention, right, all the time, and the people who make all of those things are very, very good at making them extremely alluring. And I count authors and writers with that, like, the techniques that you use as a writer to try and hook a reader in are not that different to the techniques that someone writing a show for Netflix does, or whatever, or a video game or a movie. It's all story. It's trying to like make things as compelling as possible. The thing that is difficult to compete against is social media, probably, which is so instantaneous and is probably to a certain degree eroding people's ability to concentrate. If you just look at how social media design is reshaping even things like clips and comedy. Like, now there's still comics, obviously, who will write an hour-long special, but really what you're trying to do is like do 10 seconds with captions that, when you're scrolling through TikTok or Facebook videos or whatever, just grab your attention enough. And so that stuff makes it harder, I think, for people who write books, because you're competing against things that are just the cost of like watching 50 videos while you sat on the sofa is very low, whereas to read a whole book is a big ask of people in 2024, 2025. So yeah, it is concerning, but at the same time, the books are magical, and people who love them really love them, and people find them still all the time. And so they're not going away. But yeah, the height of their popularity from 50 years ago, where a book would become a huge cultural event, even later into the 20th century, those days are probably gone. That doesn't happen so often, does it? Maybe the new Sally Rooney comes out, and that people sort of know about that, but it's not like it would have been in the 70s and 80s.
Right. I can't wait to go live in the woods and just read books. Here, there's an impending book ban, and it is an extensive list. Your old Willie is on there, Willie Shakespeare, and which is mind-boggling to me. I mean, he's a bit.
How did he make the list?
I think because he's slightly saucy,
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Have these people read the Bible? Because that's full of sauce.
Look, I say that all the time. It's the Bible is one of our saucier tomes, but the idea that there is this epic list being built of banned books and horrifying on one side, but on the other, I think, think of all the people that are going to be like, oh, well, why is that banned? And they'll start reading because everyone loves to do what they're not supposed to do. So maybe in a way,
that's a very optimistic outlook. Yeah, I like it.
I gotta be optimistic. Yeah. Gotta be optimistic, or I'll uncover the sand with the bomb and just lie on it. Well, so what is next for you?
So I'm in the relatively early stages of a new book project, which is about a court case from the 1980s. So very different to 1940s Russia. But yeah, I'm interested in, I mentioned earlier that I started out writing about the games industry, and I just uncovered this really interesting story from the United States about a dispute over whether it's possible to own the idea of video games, whether it's possible to patent an entire medium. And there was a company that was claiming it is possible to do that. A bit like if, Warner Brothers had owned the patent for movies and suddenly, went knocking on Disney's door and said, oh, if you want to make a film, you've got to pay us some money. This is basically what was happening in the 1960s, in the 70s and 80s. And it comes to a head in this court case, and that's what my book is about, is what happens next.
Did you grow up playing a lot of video games alongside of reading books?
Well, it's interesting. They were, what you say about if you ban things, they become more alluring. That was probably the case for me. Like I did have some video games, but my parents were pretty anti the idea, and didn't want to set me on that path for a while. But which made them all the more powerful, probably.
Yeah. See, I'm telling you, I'm onto something. Are your parents still with us?
Yeah, they are. They're not together, but they're around.
Do they read your books?
Yeah, my dad does, definitely. My mum supports, but I don't know if she's it's not her kind of thing, I don't think. But yeah, my dad sort of reads. I get him to read stuff before it's out, and he always gives me his feedback. Like your dad, he's a retired academic, and so it has loads of feedback to give me, but it's very helpful as well. So
oh, that's good. That's good. Well, Simon, tell people how they might find you on the evil social medias and in the world at large.
Okay, well, I'm still on Twitter, but I don't use it very much. But I'm just at Simon Parkin on that, and I'm on Blue Sky as well, which I'm using more because that seems like a more pleasant place to be. And Instagram as well. It's all just Simon Parkin, and my website is simonparkin.com, and you can see links to my journalism and books on there.
Yes, and the books are available all over the place, which is also nice. Yeah,
and there's an audio book as well. So
did you read it?
I did not know. They've got the same actor reads all three of my previous books. So hopefully you like his voice if you like audiobooks, because he's done all of them. But yeah,
I'm a big believer that audiobooks are still books, and they still count as reading, because I think anything that gets people to read in some way or another, I'm all for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you, Simon. This has been really delightful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's nice to be on here. Thank you.
And just so you know, you're at the top of my giving of Christmas gifts, because the people in my family and a lot of my friends will dig your body of work. So I'm excited to share that.
Oh, thanks. That's so kind. Thank you.
Well, have a wonderful night.
Okay, you too.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. Bye.
Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on Apple, iHeart, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.